There's a moment, quiet, unannounced, when the room you've been living in starts to feel smaller than it used to. Nothing has changed about the room. The walls are the same, the furniture hasn't moved, but you have, and suddenly the ceiling feels low, the air feels used, and some part of you that used to fit here perfectly now stands slightly hunched, slightly restless, wondering why comfort has started to feel like confinement. We rarely notice the exact hour we outgrow a version of our life. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't knock. It seeps in slowly, the way morning light seeps under a door, until one day you wake up and realize you've been living inside a story that finished writing itself a long time ago, and you're the only one still reading it. I want to talk to you tonight about that feeling, because I think most of us have felt it, and almost none of us have been taught what to do with it. The first sign is silence, where there used to be sound. The job that used to excite you now just occupies you. The friendships that used to feel like oxygen now feel like obligation. It's not that anything is wrong, exactly. It's that the emotional volume has been turned down, and you keep checking if the speakers are broken when really the song has just ended. You are standing in the silence after the music, waiting for a replay that isn't coming, because that particular song was never meant to play forever. The second sign is a kind of fatigue that sleep doesn't fix. This isn't the tiredness of doing too much, it's the tiredness of being someone you no longer are. Psychologists call it identity fatigue, the exhaustion of maintaining a self that used to be true but now requires performance. You laugh the same laugh. You say the same things at dinner parties. But some part of you is narrating your own life from a distance, watching yourself play a character whose lines you memorized years ago and no longer believe. The third sign is anger that surprises you. Not rage, just an irritability that seems to come from nowhere, aimed at everything. Growth, before it looks like clarity, often looks like friction. The soul, when it's ready to shed a life, starts to chafe against its own skin. You snap at things that never used to bother you. You feel offended by smallness, small talk, small ambitions, small rooms, because some larger version of you is trying to stand up inside a body still folded into an old shape. The fourth sign is grief for a future that hasn't even ended yet. You start mourning plans you haven't officially abandoned. A career path, a relationship, a city. You feel lost before you've made any decision, because your unconscious has already made it for you, and now it's just waiting for your conscious mind to catch up and sign the paperwork. And the fifth sign, the one that scares people most, is a craving for solitude that used to feel unnatural. You start needing silence the way you used to need company, not because you've become cold, but because transformation requires temperature. It needs a quiet furnace, not a crowded room. Every meaningful change in human history happened in someone's solitude first, long before it became a headline. The desert before the mission, the forest before the vision, the empty apartment before the reinvention. Here is what almost no one tells you about these signs. They are not malfunctions. They are intelligence. Your life is not falling apart. It is falling open. We treat discomfort like a diagnosis, like something to medicate away with distraction, when really discomfort is often the most honest feedback we ever receive. Nature doesn't ask permission before a season changes. Trees don't apologize for losing their leaves. And yet we sit inside our own autumns, embarrassed, thinking something has gone wrong with us, when really we are simply doing what every living thing does when it's ready to become something else. Think about the caterpillar for a moment, not as a metaphor we've heard too many times, but as a fact. Inside the chrysalis, the caterpillar doesn't gently rearrange itself into a butterfly. It dissolves, almost entirely. It becomes a formless liquid before it becomes anything new. If you interrupted that process, if you opened the chrysalis halfway through, you wouldn't find a half caterpillar, half butterfly. You'd find nothing recognizable at all. Just courage in liquid form, waiting to reorganize itself into flight. That's what this season of your life is. Not destruction, reorganization. Not an ending, a molting. We are so afraid of the middle. The part where we no longer recognize ourselves, but haven't yet become who we're supposed to be. We want the transformation without the dissolving. We want the butterfly without the unbearable. Formless in between. But that's not how becoming has ever worked. Not for a single living thing on this earth. There's an old idea found in nearly every culture, in nearly every era, wearing different clothing but saying the same thing, that the universe does not simply allow change, it insists on it. It closes doors not out of cruelty, but out of devotion to your becoming. It makes old versions of your life uncomfortable not to punish you, but to evict you gently from a house you've already outgrown. Because here is the truth beneath all 5 signs. You were never meant to live inside one identity forever. You are not a photograph. You are a river. And a river that stops moving doesn't stay pure. It stagnates. It's supposed to carve new paths. It's supposed to make peace with erosion, because erosion for a river isn't loss. It's how canyons are made. So when your job stops feeling like purpose, when your relationships stop feeling like home, when your own name feels borrowed, that's not the universe abandoning you. That's the universe trusting you with a harder, more honest chapter. It's handing you back to yourself, unfinished, so you can finish the sculpture with hands that have finally grown wise enough to hold the chisel properly. The tragedy isn't outgrowing your life. The tragedy is staying small enough to fit inside it anyway. So if tonight, somewhere quiet inside you, something has been whispering that it's time to leave, time to change, time to become, please don't call that whisper a crisis. Call it what it actually is. Call it the universe, finally, gently, insisting that you come home to yourself. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles into a life right before everything changes, and it's easy to mistake it for something going wrong. You wake up one morning, and the thing that used to light you up simply doesn't. The job you fought so hard to get feels like a coat that no longer fits your shoulders. The friendship that once felt like a lifeline now feels like a phone call you keep meaning to return. Nothing dramatic has happened. No betrayal, no collapse, no single moment you can point to and say, this is where it broke. And that absence of drama is exactly what makes it so disorienting, because we've been taught to expect endings to announce themselves, to arrive with noise, with conflict, with some clear villain we can blame. But most real endings are quieter than that. They arrive the way a song fades out at the end of an album, not abruptly but gradually, until you realize the room has been silent for a while, and you didn't notice when the last note actually played. This is the first sign that you've outgrown a version of your life. The volume has changed. Things that used to feel essential now feel optional. Conversations that used to feel electric now feel like static. And because so much of that world still looks the same on the outside, the same job title, the same faces at dinner, the same rhythms of the week, you start to wonder if something is wrong with you. You search for the malfunction. You assume you've become ungrateful, or numb, or broken in some way that needs fixing. So you try to turn the volume back up yourself. You force enthusiasm you don't feel. You manufacture excitement for things that used to come naturally. You keep replaying the song, hoping the silence was a glitch rather than an ending. But silence in this context isn't absence. It's information. It's your inner life quietly telling you that a particular story has finished telling itself, even if your calendar, your habits, and your obligations haven't caught up yet. Think about how many people spend years, sometimes decades, standing in that silence, waiting for a replay that was never going to come, not because they lacked the courage to leave, but because no one ever taught them that silence itself can be a signal. We're fluent in reading crisis. We're almost illiterate in reading quiet. And so we mistake the end of a song for the end of music itself, when really, it's just an invitation to notice what wants to play next. The ache you feel in that stillness isn't proof that something has died in you. It's proof that something in you is still listening for a melody that actually matches who you've become. There's a particular exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much sleep you've had. You can wake up after 8 hours, fully rested by every physical measure, and still feel like you're dragging something heavy behind you all day. This isn't the fatigue of overwork. It's the fatigue of overperformance, the quiet cost of maintaining a version of yourself that used to be effortless and now requires constant, invisible upkeep. Think about how much energy it takes to be someone, not to exist, but to be a particular someone, consistent, recognizable, predictable to the people around you. Early on, that identity fits like skin. You don't have to think about the laugh you use at dinner parties, or the opinions you're expected to hold, or the role you play in your family, your friend group, your workplace. It's automatic. But somewhere along the way, for reasons you can't always name, the fit changes. The self you've been wearing starts to feel less like skin and more like a costume, still recognizable from the outside, but requiring effort from within to keep it on straight. This is what psychologists sometimes describe as identity fatigue, the exhaustion that comes from performing a self that used to be authentic but has quietly become outdated. You still say the things you're expected to say, you still show up the way people expect you to show up, but some part of you has started watching from a slight distance, like an actor who's played the same role so many times that the words come out automatically while the mind wanders somewhere else entirely. You're present, but not fully inhabiting your own life. You're speaking your lines, but you've stopped believing them. What makes this particular exhaustion so disorienting is that it's invisible to almost everyone around you. Your friends still see the same person. Your coworkers still get the same competent colleague. Nobody else can tell that something essential has shifted because the costume still fits well enough to pass inspection. Only you know the effort it now takes to keep playing a part you've outgrown. Only you feel the strange loneliness of being fully seen by everyone except yourself. This is why so many people describe this season of life as feeling like a stranger in their own story, not because they've lost themselves, but because they've grown past the self they built years ago. And no one told them that growth sometimes looks like exhaustion rather than expansion. The tiredness isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign that some quieter, more honest version of you is trying to get your attention, tired of speaking through a character that no longer says what it actually means. It's not burnout in the traditional sense. It's the fatigue of a soul working overtime to stay convincing in a role it has already, secretly finished playing. There's a version of anger that has nothing to do with what's actually happening around you, and everything to do with what's trying to happen inside you. It shows up uninvited, sharp, sudden, disproportionate to whatever triggered it. Someone chews too loudly. A meeting runs 5 minutes over. A friend tells a story you've heard a dozen times before, and instead of the usual patience, something in you flares. You catch yourself snapping at people who don't deserve it, feeling offended by things that never used to register, and afterward you sit there confused, wondering where that came from, because it doesn't feel like you. We tend to treat this kind of irritability as a character flaw, something to apologize for and suppress. But it's worth asking a different question. What if this friction isn't a flaw at all, but a symptom of something outgrowing its container? Think about how a plant, root-bound in a pot too small for it, doesn't simply stop growing quietly. It pushes. It cracks the ceramic. It sends roots searching through the drainage holes for soil that doesn't exist yet. From the outside, that cracking might look like damage. From the inside, it's the most honest thing happening. The plant doing exactly what living things do when they've outgrown their boundaries. This is often what irritability actually is, the emotional equivalent of roots pressing against the walls of a life that used to have enough room. Small talk starts to feel unbearable, not because you've become arrogant, but because a larger conversation is trying to happen inside you, one that doesn't yet have words. Small ambitions in the people around you start to grate, not because you think less of them, but because something in you is straining toward a scale it hasn't reached yet. And the mismatch creates heat. Even your own routines can start to feel offensive in their smallness. The same commute, the same conversations, the same four walls that used to feel safe now feel like they're pressing in from every direction. What makes this stage so disorienting is that it often arrives before any clarity does. You don't get the insight first and the irritability second, in some neat, understandable order. The friction comes first, messy, confusing, sometimes even embarrassing, and the understanding trails behind it, sometimes by months. This is why growth is so often mistaken for regression. People around you may say you've become harder to please, more difficult, less content, and in a narrow sense they're right. But what they're witnessing isn't decline. It's the discomfort of a self that has become too large for the shape it's been living in, chafing against walls it once fit inside without a second thought. The irritation isn't the problem. It's the proof that something in you refuses to stay small any longer, even before you've figured out what bigger is supposed to look like. There's a strange kind of grief that visits people long before anything has officially ended. You're still in the relationship, still in the job, still living in the city. Nothing has been decided, no papers signed, no conversations had, and yet you find yourself mourning it anyway, quietly, in moments no one else can see. You'll be sitting across from someone you love and feel a wave of sadness for a future you haven't even left yet, as if some part of you already knows what your conscious mind hasn't been willing to admit. This is one of the more disorienting signs of outgrowing a life, because it doesn't feel like clarity. It feels like betrayal. How can you be grieving something that's still here? How can you miss a person who's sitting right in front of you? Or feel nostalgic for a job you haven't quit? Or ache for a home you haven't packed a single box out of? It seems irrational, even cruel, to feel loss for something that technically still belongs to you. But the unconscious mind doesn't operate on the same timeline as the calendar. It doesn't wait for official endings. It reads patterns, trajectories, the slow accumulation of small truths, and it often arrives at the real ending, long before your waking mind is ready to face the decision that matches it. Think of it like standing at a dock, watching a ship you're technically still aboard, except some part of you has already stepped onto the shore. You can feel the distance growing even though your feet haven't moved. This is what anticipatory grief actually is. Not sadness about the future, but sadness that has arrived early, ahead of schedule. Because your inner life has already done the math, your outer life hasn't caught up to yet. You mourn the version of the relationship that used to work. You mourn the career path you can feel yourself quietly abandoning, one unenthusiastic Monday at a time. You mourn a future self who was supposed to live in a particular house with a particular person, doing particular work, and you mourn it even though on paper that future is still technically available to you. What makes this so hard to sit with is the guilt that comes attached to it. We assume grief should only be reserved for things that are truly gone, and so feeling it prematurely seems like a kind of self-sabotage, as if you're mourning your way into an ending, rather than waiting to see if things might still work out. But grief arriving early isn't the cause of the ending. It's evidence that some part of you has already been honest with itself, even while the rest of you keeps showing up, keeps performing the role, keeps hoping the sadness is a phase rather than a signal. That ache isn't dragging you toward a loss you don't want. It's walking ahead of you, gently, into a truth you haven't yet had the courage to face directly, carrying the grief so that by the time you finally arrive there yourself, you won't be facing it entirely alone. There's a particular kind of homecoming that has nothing to do with returning to a place, and everything to do with returning to a self you'd quietly wandered away from. We tend to think of change as something we do to our lives, a decision, a plan, a series of deliberate steps toward becoming someone new. But there's another kind of change, older and less controllable, that doesn't wait for our permission. It shows up as circumstance, as doors closing that we didn't choose to close, as people leaving, plans dissolving, ground shifting beneath feet that thought they were standing on something solid. And in those moments, it's tempting to believe the universe has turned against us, that we're being punished, unlucky, singled out for some private cruelty. But look closely at the architecture of most transformation, and a different pattern emerges. The job that ends unexpectedly was often one you'd already outgrown in every way except the paycheck. The relationship that collapses was often one you'd already left emotionally, long before it left you physically. The city that stops feeling like home was often just the last stage set for a story you'd already finished performing. What looks like disruption from the outside is very often, on closer inspection, completion, not punishment, correction, not abandonment, redirection towards something more honest than the life you'd been quietly settling for. This is why so many people, looking back on their most painful chapters, eventually describe them the same way, as the moment everything fell apart in order to fall into place. Not because suffering is secretly good, and not because every hardship is a hidden blessing in disguise. That's too simple, too easy, and it disrespects the real weight of genuine loss. But because there is a difference between a life ending and a life being interrupted on its way to becoming something truer. The universe doesn't consult us before it insists on our growth. It doesn't ask if we're ready. It simply makes the old version of our life increasingly difficult to inhabit, until staying becomes more painful than leaving, and the decision we'd been avoiding gets made for us, gently or otherwise. What this means is that the discomfort so many of us fear, the closed doors, the failed plans, the abrupt endings, may not be evidence that we've lost our way. It may be evidence that something larger than our 5-year plan is escorting us back toward a version of ourselves we'd started to forget. Not a stranger, not someone entirely new, just the self that existed before we learned to shrink, before we adjusted our voice to fit smaller rooms, before comfort convinced us to mistake a cage for a home. Coming home to yourself doesn't always look like arrival. Sometimes it looks exactly like loss, like confusion, like standing in the wreckage of a life you don't recognize anymore. But underneath that wreckage is usually the same quiet truth. You were never actually being pushed away from your life. You were being pushed back toward it, the one that was yours all along, waiting patiently for you to stop settling for anything smaller. There's a moment in the caterpillar's transformation that most retellings skip over, probably because it's too uncomfortable to sit with. We love the ending of that story, the wings, the color, the flight, but we rarely talk about the middle, the part where the caterpillar doesn't gracefully rearrange itself into something new. It dissolves, almost entirely. Inside the chrysalis, its body breaks down into a formless liquid, a kind of biological soup with no legs, no shape, nothing you'd recognize as either caterpillar or butterfly. If you cut open a chrysalis at that stage, hoping to catch transformation in progress, you wouldn't find a half-formed creature bridging the two. You'd find almost nothing at all. Just the raw material of becoming, unassembled, waiting. This is the part of change we're never taught to expect, and it's why so many people panic in the middle of their own transformations. We imagine growth as addition, new skills stacked onto old ones, a better version layered gently over the last. But real transformation often works the other way. It asks you to lose your shape before it gives you a new one. It asks you to become, for a while, something unrecognizable even to yourself. Not less than you were, but not yet anything you can name either. This is the part where people say things like, "I don't know who I am anymore," and mean it literally, not poetically. And it's terrifying, because our entire nervous system is wired to seek stability, to know what we are so we can function inside a coherent story. The formless stage offers no such comfort. It only offers trust. What makes this so disorienting is that dissolution looks, from the outside and often from the inside too, exactly like falling apart. There is no visible difference in that moment between a person collapsing and a person reorganizing at the deepest level. The confusion, the loss of old certainties, the sense that nothing solid is left to stand on, all of it could just as easily be catastrophe as metamorphosis. The only way to tell the difference, most of the time, is what comes after. And that's precisely why this stage requires something almost nobody wants to give it: patience without evidence. Faith that the liquid mess inside the chrysalis is not the end of the story, even though every visible sign suggests otherwise. Nature never rushes this part, and never skips it either. There's no version of the transformation where the caterpillar keeps its old legs and simply grows wings alongside them. The old structure has to go first, completely, before the new one can exist. So when your own life feels like it's dissolved into something formless, when the job, the relationship, the identity, the certainty you used to stand on has liquefied into confusion, it may not mean you're broken. It may mean you're finally in the one stage of becoming that never announces itself. The quiet, invisible middle where everything falls apart on its way to becoming something that can finally fly.